The evening was in full swing at Lucille, a restaurant whose name meant the sky, and whose prices were certainly out of this world. The air hummed with the quiet sounds of luxury, the soft clink of crystal glasses, the murmur of polite conversation, and the gentle melody of a piano playing in a far corner. The lights were dim, casting a warm, golden glow on the rich, dark wood and the crisp, white tablecloths. Every person in the room looked important, dressed in clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Moving through this scene of polished wealth was the maitre d', a man whose job was to be the picture of perfect, silent service. He glided between tables, his back straight, his face a mask of pleasant neutrality. Right now, he was leading a small group to the best table in the house, one tucked into a corner with a fantastic view of the city's glittering skyline. The man at the center of the group was the reason for the special treatment. He was a man known to everyone from the business pages of the newspaper to the gossip columns. He had made his fortune in technology, building a company that changed how people shopped online. His name was Alastair Finch, and he carried himself with the unshakable confidence of someone who was used to the world bending to his will. He wasn't a particularly tall or strong-looking man, but his presence filled the room. He wore a simple, exquisitely tailored suit that probably cost as much as a small car. His watch was a rare, mechanical piece that didn't flash or sparkle, but whispered its expense to those who knew what to look for. His eyes, a cool, sharp gray, scanned the room quickly, taking in everything and seeming to find it all a little bit lacking. Following him were three other people, two men and a woman. They were his associates, smart and successful in their own right, but next to Alastair they seemed to shrink. They laughed a little too quickly at his jokes and nodded a little too eagerly at his opinions. For them, this dinner was a meeting. For Alastair, it was another stage for him to perform on. He settled into his plush chair like a king taking his throne. He didn't even look at the menu the maitre d' offered him. He already knew what he wanted. He ordered for the entire table, his voice a calm, low drone that expected no argument. The wine was chosen with a wave of his hand, something old and French and terrifyingly expensive. As the food and wine began to flow, Alastair held court. He talked about a recent deal, a new acquisition, his views on the global economy. His associates listened, their faces a mixture of admiration and a faint, unspoken anxiety. They knew their jobs depended on staying in his good graces. The conversation was all about big numbers, big ideas, and the big power that Alastair Finch wielded so easily. In the middle of one of his stories, their server approached the table. She was a young woman with her dark hair tied back in a neat, practical bun. Her movements were smooth and efficient, a quiet dance of placing plates, filling water glasses, and clearing empty dishes without ever being asked. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and her face, while polite, was calm and unreadable. A small name tag on her crisp, white shirt read Clara. Alastair's eyes followed her for a moment as she refilled his companion's glass. He didn't really see her. He saw the function she performed. She was part of the machinery of this expensive place, a human component designed to make his evening seamless. She was invisible in the way that all service staff were invisible to a man like him. His table was laughing now, the wine loosening their tongues and their inhibitions. One of the associates had just told a slightly clumsy joke, and the laughter that followed was a bit too loud for the quiet room. Alastair gave a small, tight smile. He was growing bored. The performance was starting to feel too easy, the audience too willing. He needed a new game. His eyes landed on Clara again. She was standing a few feet away, her hands clasped behind her back, waiting patiently for a signal from another table. A thought, cruel and playful, began to form in Alastair's mind. He imagined her life, a small apartment, a struggling family, dreams of a new television or a nice vacation. He pictured her giving simple, foolish financial advice, the kind that would sound charmingly naive. It would be the perfect entertainment, a little lesson for his table on the vast intellectual gap between those who made the world move and those who simply served them. A slow, smug smile spread across his face. The perfect punchline had just walked into his show, and she didn't even know it yet. He waited for the right moment, the lull in the conversation when all attention would be on him. He was about to ask his question, and he was already looking forward to the laugh that would follow. The rich food had been eaten, the plates cleared away, leaving only the dark, polished wood of the table and the half-empty glasses of expensive wine. The main performance of the dinner was over, but for the man at the head of the table, the evening's real entertainment was just about to begin. He felt a familiar restlessness, a desire to poke at the world around him just to see what would happen. He watched the young waitress, the one named Clara, as she moved. She wasn't flashy or nervous like some of the other staff. She was steady. Her hands were sure as she gathered the final dessert plates onto her tray, never making a clatter. She worked with a quiet rhythm, a kind of calm efficiency that made her almost fade into the background. To him, she was like a piece of well-made furniture, useful but not something you really saw. His three companions were leaning back in their chairs, looking satisfied and relaxed, chatting about a golf game planned for the weekend. They were still basking in the glow of his company, of having been part of his inner circle for the evening. He knew that feeling. He saw it on people's faces all the time. It was the look of people who felt special because he had allowed them to be near him. He decided now was the time. He shifted in his chair, the fine leather creaking softly under his weight. The movement was small, but it was enough. His companions immediately stopped their chatter and turned their heads towards him, their faces eager, ready for whatever he was going to say next. He had their complete attention, and he loved the feeling. He let his eyes drift over to Clara as she finished stacking the plates on her tray. He cleared his throat lightly. "Clara, was it?" he began, his voice smooth and friendly, but with a hint of something else underneath. A playful condescension that his tablemates recognized immediately. One of them, a man with a neatly trimmed beard, hid a smile by taking a sip of his water. Clara looked up, her hands still on the tray. Her expression didn't change. It wasn't nervous or overly eager. It was just attentive. "Yes, sir?" she replied, her voice even and clear. "You've been wonderfully attentive this evening," he said, spreading his hands in a generous gesture. "Truly, a credit to the place." He paused, letting the empty compliment hang in the air for a moment. "You know, a man in my position is always looking for new perspectives, fresh ideas. It's so easy to get stuck in an echo chamber, hearing the same advice from the same highly paid experts." He saw one of his associates, the woman, raise her eyebrows slightly, intrigued by where this was going. He gave her a subtle, knowing look. "So I find myself curious," he continued, turning his full gaze back to Clara. He leaned forward just a little, as if he were about to share a secret. "Let's say I have a rather trivial sum of money sitting around. Nothing major, let's call it $2 million. It's just gathering dust. I thought, who better to ask than someone living in the real world? Someone with their feet on the ground." He paused again, his smile widening. "So what would you do with it, if it were yours? What is your best financial advice?" The question landed in the middle of the table like a carefully thrown stone, creating ripples of silent anticipation. The man with the beard pressed his lips together, trying hard not to laugh. The woman looked down at her lap, a faint blush of second-hand embarrassment on her cheeks. The third associate just stared at Clara, a wide, expectant grin on his face. They all knew the game. They had seen him do variations of this before. Ask a taxi driver for stock tips, or a barber for his thoughts on international politics. It was never about the answer. It was about the moment of gentle public humiliation that followed, the moment he would gracefully, and with great intelligence, explain why the answer was naive and foolish. It was a way for him to demonstrate his superiority, and for them to feel like they were in on the joke. The air seemed to grow still. The gentle piano music from the corner felt suddenly very distant. All the focus was on the young woman in the simple white shirt and black apron, holding a tray of dirty dishes. They waited for the predictable, simple-minded response. Maybe she would talk about buying a big house, a dream she'd seen on television, or perhaps a round-the-world trip. Maybe she'd say she'd give it all to her family, a sweet but financially illiterate sentiment. Maybe she would even freeze, stammering, too shocked by the number to form a sentence. That was what the billionaire and his friends were waiting for. That was the punchline. Clara didn't freeze. She didn't stammer. She didn't get flustered or look around for help. For a second, she simply held the billionaire's gaze, her head tilted just a fraction, as if she were truly considering the question. Her eyes were thoughtful. She placed the tray down gently on a nearby service stand, freeing her hands. Then, she looked directly at him, her posture straight but not stiff. There was no anger in her face, no embarrassment. There was only a calm, quiet focus. She was about to speak, and something in her demeanor, a sudden and unexpected seriousness, made the smirk on the billionaire's face falter, just for a heartbeat. The stage was his, but for the first time all night, he wasn't entirely sure he was still the one in control of the script. The air at the table felt thick and heavy. The playful, mocking energy that the billionaire had created just moments before seemed to freeze solid. Clara didn't look like a punchline anymore. She looked like a professional about to give a report. She met his gaze, her eyes clear and steady. "Well, sir?" she began, her voice not much louder than before, but it now carried in the silence. "Considering the current macroeconomic climate and the potential for a market correction, I wouldn't advise letting it sit idle, nor would I advise a single large, risky bet." The words were simple, but they were not the words anyone was expecting. They were the kind of words you heard in boardrooms, not in five-star restaurants from a waitress. The man with the neatly trimmed beard, who had been trying not to laugh, slowly lowered his glass of water back to the table. His smile was completely gone. The billionaire felt a small, strange jolt, like a tiny electrical shock. His own smile felt stiff on his face. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a signal for her to continue. But it wasn't a gesture of permission anymore. It was one of surprise. Clara continued, her hands resting calmly at her sides. "First," she said, "I'd pay off any high-interest debt. There's no investment that reliably beats a 20% interest rate on a credit card. That's just throwing money away." She said it with the straightforward certainty of someone stating that the sky is blue. One of the associates, the one who had been grinning, unconsciously nodded in agreement before catching himself and looking down at the tablecloth. Then, Clara went on, "I'd allocate a portion, perhaps 10%, into a highly liquid emergency fund. Life is unpredictable. A job loss, a medical issue. Having cash on hand prevents you from having to sell your investments at a loss during a bad time." The billionaire listened, his mind scrambling to catch up. This was not a dream about a big house or a fancy car. This was a cold, calculated, and perfectly rational financial strategy. It was the foundation of every sound wealth management plan. He had sat through presentations from his own advisors, men in $1,000 suits, saying these exact same things. Clara wasn't finished. Her voice remained even and calm, as if she were explaining the specials of the day. "After that, I'd diversify the remainder. A solid base should be in low-cost index funds for steady, reliable growth over time. It's not glamorous, but it works." She then looked directly at the billionaire, and for a second, it felt less like a server talking to a customer and more like two colleagues discussing a portfolio. "I'd also put a slice into a REIT. That's a real estate investment trust. It gives you exposure to the property market without the hassle of being a landlord. And finally," she said, "a small, calculated percentage could go into a curated portfolio of growth stocks. Sectors like renewable energy and semiconductors. They're volatile, but the long-term growth potential is significant." She paused, letting the technical terms settle in the air. The piano player in the corner had started a new song, but no one at the table was listening. "The key, of course," she concluded, her tone shifting to one of simple, final wisdom, "is not timing the market, but time in the market. Patience and discipline almost always beat frantic buying and selling. It was one of the oldest, most fundamental rules of investing. It was the first thing they taught in finance class, and it had just been delivered to a billionaire by his waitress." For a long moment, no one spoke. The three associates were frozen, their eyes wide. They looked from Clara to their boss and back again, unsure of what to do or say. The carefully constructed joke had exploded in their faces, and they were covered in the silence. Clara, however, seemed completely unaffected by the shock she had caused. She picked up her tray of dishes as if she had just explained the different types of mineral water. She gave a small, polite smile. "Would you like your check now, sir?" she asked, her voice returning to its normal, professional tone. The billionaire could only stare. His mouth was slightly open. The smug, superior expression had been wiped completely from his face, replaced by a look of pure, uncomprehending astonishment. He had asked a silly question to amuse himself, and he had received a masterclass in financial planning. The world, for a moment, had turned upside down. The silence that fell over the table was heavy and complete. It was a different kind of quiet than before. Earlier, the silence had been one of waiting, of people holding their breath for a punchline. This silence was the sound of a joke that had died, leaving only awkwardness and shock in its place. The three associates looked like statues. The man with the beard had his hand still resting on his water glass, frozen mid-reach. The woman who had blushed earlier now had her eyes fixed on the tablecloth as if she were trying to count the individual threads. The third man, the one who had been grinning, just stared blankly into space, his mind seemingly unable to process what he had just heard. The only sound was the gentle, distant melody of the piano, which now felt strangely loud and out of place. The billionaire, Alistair Finch, did not move. He sat perfectly still in his expensive chair, his body rigid. He was looking at the space where Clara had been standing, but he wasn't really seeing the restaurant anymore. He was seeing the words she had spoken, replaying them in his mind. Macroeconomic climate, market correction, liquid emergency fund, REIT, diversified portfolio. Each word was a small, precise hammer tap on the bubble of his own superiority. This wasn't a lucky guess or a line from a movie. This was a structured, intelligent, and, he had to admit, a better articulated financial plan than some of his junior analysts could produce. The sheer, impossible correctness of her answer was what stunned him the most. It was like asking a child about rocket science and having them perfectly explain the physics of orbital mechanics. His face felt warm. The smug, self-satisfied smile was gone, leaving behind a strange, empty feeling. He had been so sure of the game. He had set the stage, chosen the player, and waited for the laugh. But she had changed the rules. She hadn't gotten flustered or given a silly answer. She had simply answered him. Seriously and expertly. He felt a fool. Not the kind of fool who slips on a banana peel, but the deeper, more humiliating kind, the fool who reveals his own ignorance while trying to mock someone else's. He had wanted to show the gap between his world and hers, and she had effortlessly bridged it with a few calm sentences. One of his associates, the woman, cleared her throat softly. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet. It broke the spell. The billionaire blinked and slowly turned his head towards her, but his eyes were still unfocused. Clara had not waited for a response to her question about the check. She had simply gone to the payment terminal, completed the transaction, and was now walking back towards the table. Her footsteps were quiet on the plush carpet. In her hand, she held the leather bill folder and his black credit card. She placed it on the table in front of him with the same efficient, respectful motion she had used all evening. There was no "I told you so" in her eyes. There was no smirk of victory. Her expression was exactly the same as it had been when she brought them their first course. Polite, professional, and completely detached from the emotional earthquake she had just caused. The sight of the bill folder finally jolted him back to the present. This was real. This was happening. He had to say something, do something, to end this agonizing moment. He needed to get out of this chair and out of this restaurant. He reached for the folder, his movements stiff. His fingers, which were usually so steady when signing multi-million-dollar contracts, fumbled slightly as he took his card back and slipped it into his wallet. He didn't even look at the total. The number, no matter how large, felt insignificant compared to the lesson he had just been given for free. He managed to stand up. The legs of his chair scraped softly against the floor. The sound prompted his associates to scramble to their feet as well, their movements hurried and clumsy. They were desperate to leave, to escape the scene of their boss's humiliation. But as he turned to go, A single burning question rose up in his throat. He couldn't leave without asking it. The need to understand was stronger than his embarrassment. He stopped and turned back to look at Clara, who was already beginning to clear the final glasses from the table. "Wait," he said, and his voice came out as a rough croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. Where did you learn all that?" The word "wait" hung in the air, a desperate hook thrown into the sea of his own embarrassment. He had to know. He couldn't just walk away with this strange, hollow feeling inside. The three associates, who had been so eager to leave, now froze again, turning back to watch this final, unexpected scene. Clara paused, her hands holding two empty wine glasses. She looked at the billionaire, her expression still calm, but perhaps with a tiny hint of understanding in her eyes. She could see the genuine confusion on his face, the complete dismantling of his earlier arrogance. He wasn't a powerful man mocking her anymore. He was just a confused person asking a question. She placed the glasses back down on the table gently, giving him her full attention. "Well, sir," she began, her tone as straightforward as when she had given her financial advice. "I graduated top of my class in finance from Creston University." The statement was simple, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Creston University. It was one of the top 3 business schools in the country. Its graduates were fought over by the biggest banks and investment firms in the world. The billionaire himself had tried to recruit from there just last year. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, not of pride, but of a quiet irony. "I'm actually waiting for my Series 7 exam results. It's the license you need to become a proper financial advisor. As soon as the results come through, I'll be starting a position at Greystone Financial in the fall." Greystone Financial, another heavyweight, a direct competitor to some of his own company's investment arms. The pieces of the puzzle were snapping into place with dizzying speed, and the picture they formed made him feel foolish beyond words. He had assumed her life was small. He had assumed her dreams were simple. He had been wrong on every count. Clara picked up the 2 wine glasses again, her movement signaling that this conversation, like the meal, was coming to an end. She looked around the beautiful, opulent restaurant, at the soft lighting, the rich patrons, the air of exclusive luxury. "This job," she said, her gaze sweeping over the room before returning to him. "It pays the bills while I wait. The hours are flexible and the tips are good." She paused, and her eyes held a new depth, a spark of sharp intelligence he had been completely blind to before. "But it also offers a fascinating study in human behavior. You learn a lot about people by how they treat someone they think is beneath them." And with that, she gave a final, small, polite nod. "I hope you all have a pleasant evening." She turned and walked away, the glasses in her hands, moving back into the rhythm of her work. She disappeared through a service door, leaving the 4 of them standing alone in the plush silence of the dining room. The billionaire stood rooted to the spot, watching the door swing shut. The words echoed in his mind, a fascinating study in human behavior. He had been the subject of her study tonight. He had been the specimen. He came in to feel powerful, to put on a show, and he had ended up providing her with a perfect example of arrogance and ignorance, all wrapped up in an expensive suit. That he finally turned and, without a word to his companions, walked towards the exit. The maitre d' bowed and wished him a good night, but the billionaire didn't even see him. He stepped out of the climate-controlled air of the restaurant and into the cool, real air of the night. His expensive car was waiting for him at the curb, the engine purring softly. But for a moment, he just stood on the sidewalk, letting the reality of the evening sink in. He had learned a lesson, one that no business school could ever teach. He had been reminded that a person's current situation is not the full measure of their mind or their potential. Wisdom and ambition don't always wear a name tag. Sometimes, they wear a server's apron, quietly biding their time, observing, and learning from the mistakes of those who are too proud to see them. He slid into the soft leather seat of his car, but the comfort felt different now. The world outside the window looked a little different, too. A little less certain and a little more real. He had gone to the restaurant to feel like a king, but he was leaving with a dose of something much more valuable. a lesson in humility, served to him by a waitress on a silver tray.